Let me introduce the guests that we have. And to my extreme left, we have Mr. Michael Agwanda. Good morning and thank you for joining us. We also have Dr. Sam Kamau. Good morning and thank you for joining us to basically look at that. Let's start off with possibly 2013. And this would be more to look at whether they performed or not. And just a quick reminder so that we refresh ourselves. We do have the Deputy President basically in 2013 declaring that the only two politicians that they would have in cabinet is the president and the deputy. Let's just remind ourselves what he had to say.
These men and women are not politicians. In the cabinet, there will be only two politicians, the president and myself. These other men and women, their business is not politics. Their business is to deliver on the agenda we have for Kenyans. And for the record, in the interviews that we have conducted, we haven't asked any one of them which party they voted for, because that is not relevant when we are looking for the men and women that are going to serve this country in the cabinet secretary position.
All right, so that was in 2013. Now, gentlemen, of course, we have the privilege of knowing that's what he said, but maybe things played out differently. But maybe before we even get into that, Dr. Sam, let me start with you. For the sake of understanding the whole discussion, what would be the difference between a technocrat and a politician?
Thank you, Michael. I think I was actually reflecting on that when you talk about politicians, because I think nowadays it's almost possible to conclude everybody is a politician
in one way or the other.
given the heightened political environment in the country. But I think in the context of what he was talking about, basically is, remember before the separation of powers, where we used to have elected MPs also serving as members of the cabinet. Now, the separation, so where now the legislature, or people who are elected within the National Assembly, and also the Senate, restricting themselves to that particular role. And then the technocrats, these are people either drawn from, the corporate world, or even from the civil service, but basically they are not elected politicians. And I think that is a specific distinction they were trying to give. So perhaps they were being brought on board because of their experience, because of their academic qualification, because of the understanding of specific issues, but they are not in elective politics.
Okay. Yeah. Michael, do you think that their strategy worked, given that it sounds very good on paper to have technocrats? Because really, technocrats are there to ensure they drive the agenda by virtue of the fact that there's performance. Politicians, however, on the other hand, are there to manage, what we'd call emotional feelings and how people get around their business. But looking at Jubilee's cabinet in the last, the last 5 years, would you say that it worked?
I really don't think that it worked. The only time that the technocrats worked, I think, was during the time of Dream Team, where we had the likes of Martin Oduor, the like of Professor Midola Gort, where we had the likes of Leakey, who came into the government and shaped the government to a point. But what happened is the constitution changed in 2010, where the elected parliamentarians were not going to find themselves among the executive. But previously, it is a constitution that provided that you could only get the executive from the elected members of parliament or perhaps senators, if they were then. But then when the constitution changed, it gave the president the leeway to get his executive, the CSS, from the private sector, which they did well. But as you could see, Mike, it was only for a short time before the technocrats became the politicians. I mean, the transition was so quickly. Yeah, it changed so quickly, because when you're a technocrat, you are expected to execute your mandate with great professionalism, without any biasness whatsoever or a political affiliation. But we realized very quickly that everybody that was employed needed to pledge an allegiance to the party that, of course, was the leading party, and that was the government party. which was Jubilee. And in a nutshell, you become a Jubilee party member, whether you like it or not. Because when you're explaining the policies and the philosophies of that very government, you are representing the party. And for that reason, there is no line in between you being a technocrat or a politician. And you've realized that for the last 4.5 years, what people have said that has actually dented this government more than any other thing is lack of communication. Being able to communicate, I know Sam is an expert in communication, being able to communicate the activities of the government in a way that the people, it will resonate with the people, and the people will understand that something is going on in this country. If anything, any other time that there was serious conversation and discourse about issues in this country, it was bordering corruption, and not very much in terms of the good things that were happening in this country. And so they started realizing that the technocrats were not talking a lot. Perhaps they were not explaining, as much as they were needed to explain so the country would get to know what they were doing. And then they said, maybe we need to look at politicians. And you saw General Nkaseri being brought on board when Olelenku was pulled out of the Interior, Ministry. And, General Olelenku Nkaseri was a politician. He was an MP with the, ODM, and you can see he was brought in. And when he was brought in into the Interior Ministry, things changed. Things started taking an upward mobility, kind of process, because there was a politician, but there was also a technocrat in that field who was General Nkaseri was a general, basically served in the military.
Right.
So he brought some order into it, and I think that is what really changed the way this guy started thinking about technical guys and politicians.
Yeah, Dr. Kamau.
Let me weigh in a little bit on that. I wouldn't pass that verdict and say that, technocrats, it didn't exactly work, or politicians would be the preferred way to go. Because if you look at those who hit the ground running, people who had been in government previously, at a certain point, I'm talking about Rotich, I'm talking about Waiguru, I'm talking about, it was Kamau, who was in charge of roads and infrastructure. I'm also talking about Amina Mohammed. These are the people who understood the workings of government at that particular point, and that is why initially, especially in the first phase, they seemed to be, things seemed to be working for them in the dockets that they were given, partly because they knew the structures of government, they knew how the policies work, they knew the flow of issues within government. For those who are brought straight from the private sector, they struggled a little bit trying to find their way. And that is why there was that specific distinction early on. Of course, agreeing with him is that when you understand if your responsibility is also to deliver on the agenda of the ruling party and the manifesto, that is, you can't dissociate that from the political role. Now, the second thing that maybe I would also want to, as way of background, when the deputy president said that there will be no politicians in the cabinet. And then just, I think a day or two later, they unveiled, Balala, Najib Balala, and Charity Ngilu, and Kazungu Kambi. Part, of course, was forced by the fact that at that time, Jubilee was a coalition of about, I think, 4 parties. There was URP, there was TNA, there was NAC, and I think there was the Republican something Congress, Balala's party. And therefore, even the need to include some of those people in government, of course, and it could only be maybe the party leaders, and that is why Ngilu and Balala found their way into the cabinet. But I want also to agree with him that besides just delivering, and besides on working on the docket that have been given, you must also be seen to be championing in a way. Also, that is perhaps what we would say the political bit, but it's what politicians understand best. That besides just doing your work, you must also shout about what you're doing. You must also create a spectacle around what you are doing. And I think that is what somebody like Fred Matiang'i discovered early on. You do something, but you make sure that there is some noise around what you're doing. And so that people, actually now there is that perception that he has been the most hardworking.
And with Matiang'i, is it really that he makes noise, or that you can actually see and quantify what he is making noise about? Because then the difference between a technocrat per se and a politician is that politicians are good at making noise at things which are amorphous, which you possibly cannot put your hands on. They're not tangible. But if you look at maybe Dr. Fred Matiang'i, you can literally follow a track and say that this is what he has said, this is what has been done, and here are the results?
I would want to contrast Matiang'i, agreeing with him, and I'll not take anything away from him, agreeing with what you have said. But if you look at Aden Mohamed, he's been fairly quiet. I don't know actually what I would associate with, with him over the last 4.5 years or 5 years that has been in government. And maybe there's a lot that has been going on in his ministry, industrialization and all that, but maybe he's been so quiet about it. He's not able to shout about what he is doing. And in terms of, and you remember, part of what the Jubilee government struggled with during the campaigns is actually convincing people that we have done something. Until the last minute when they came up with the delivery portal and the campaign of GUK delivers, to try and tell people this is actually what we have been doing, because for the longest time there was a sense, like you say, the narrative centered around there was so much corruption, or the government has not done anything, or maybe they were just relaunching the projects that had been initiated by Kibaki previously. So there's a sense in which politicians, but I would not exactly say politicians, is people who also understand the power and the role of the media, so that in terms of what you're doing, and perhaps that is what gave somebody like Alfred Mutua the edge, in the sense that he understands communication, he understands the media and how things work, so that when you do something small, whether you buy some ambulances or you do a road, you shout about it, you make sure that there is some noise around that, and people now believe that you're the most hardworking governor. And I think those are some of the lessons that I would say the president and his deputy learned.
Okay.
I think in some cases, as a way in on some of these ministers that might not have spoken much. But, man, when you saw what they did, a case in point is Amina Mohamed, Minister of Foreign Affairs. I think this, beautiful lady did this country great justice than any other ministers in the history of Minister of Foreign Affairs. We've had so many conferences brought in this country. We've had so many presidents brought in this country, and I believe it was through the hard work of Amina Mohamed. We had President Obama visit the country. I mean, that was the first president ever to visit this country of the United States of America, coming in his office while still in the office to visit. Well, he may have the roots here, but he took the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Amina Mohamed to convince him that this was a good place to visit. And soon after that, we've seen the Israel Prime Minister come to the country. She may not be speaking much, but you can see how much dollars have been brought into this country as a result of those regional and international conferences. In fact, we are having, I think in the next few days, we might be having, African, conference led by the Chinese themselves in Kenya. And you're wondering, why wouldn't they have it in China? Why would they bring it in Kenya? But because there is great, great work being done by Amina Mohamed. And if you see, she may not be talking much as perhaps Matiang'i is talking. But of course, Matiang'i, we're not taking anything away from him. But he's talking, but he's doing it. But Amina may not be talking. In fact, the only place you'll see her is in those conferences. But the underwork, the behind the curtain work that is going on every single month to bring a conference here is a great testimony of what a single individual can do, even without doing much.
All right. And it is now 21 minutes after 7. I want us to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll look at possibly what Kenyans feel regarding the cabinet secretaries that were there before we speculate and maybe project on what kind of cabinet that we expect that the president and Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy would do. So do stay with us right here on Morning Express. We're taking a short break. We'll be right back.